So these ideas that Sutton is bringing up through his works, showing how the Bolshevik Revolution, the whole Cold War, everything was Western financed, and that was all a sham. He's saying it's like this history has been here, and he was the first guy to do that work for Stanford, and he got fired for it. But he kept writing, and he kept exposing what he could. He comes across Charlotte Iserbyt's work on the Skull and Bones, and he publishes a book on that. Now back to your question about the Council on Foreign Relations, what you'll see is when you take into consideration its membership. So if you were using the personal brain software, you'd start with Council on Foreign Relations, and then you'd start adding people in. As you add people into their membership, look at the jobs and who they've worked with and what's interconnected. Oh, you might see the Gulf of Tonkin. You might see any number of assassinations that have gone on. You'll start to see that the CIA doesn't do its own thinking. It gets its personality, if you will, from the National Security Advisors, which Zelikow was one, and the CFR, right? They're not taking Bilderberg and Trilateral members for that. That's, CFR is United States specific, and it's here to turn our country inside out so that it reflects more likely, a collectivist Soviet Union and not the America that is supposed to be celebrated on July 4th every year. Lenin was trained in Switzerland and carried by private train. It would be interesting research to find out whose private train car transported Lenin in at this convenient time when there had already been a small revolution, and then these other people come in and they basically rebrand that revolution, much like what you've seen in Egypt, Libya, what's going on in Syria right now. So there's a long, rich history. In fact, I want to just pull one little artifact here, because this is a recent Foreign Affairs magazine. This is printed by the Council on Foreign Relations. You see Death from Above. They got the drones on here. They're really liking the drone programs. And there's an article in the back about transnationalism that talks about how America is an isolationist country. And so what you see is, this is almost 100 years after the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations. They are still trying to take away American sovereignty and have transnational law that supersedes the Constitution and puts us under the United Nations. So the idea is, even though this has been going on for a long time, there has been a serious resistance in this country because there are few enough individuals who have intellectual self-defense to remind the rest of the people that you can put some questioning in between stimulus and response, and you can escape all this propaganda that we've been inundated with. We're taught to read, but we're not taught how to think. So let's just ponder that for a second. And then consider that literacy is a form of slavery until you consistently use a method of critical thinking to identify and validate the contents of your mind, right? So they use reading against us for a long time, and they make the books hard to find. But if we organize the books and present them out there and let people know they exist and they start reading them, then we're reversing that whole situation. Then we're undumbing ourselves down. And education is defined in the 1828 Johnson's Dictionary as the unocculting, the unhiding of information, useful information. Right? So when we talk about the power structure occulting or hiding information, well, it's in their nature, right? So what's not in our nature is to tolerate it. I don't fault the guy who thinks he's a king. I fault the people around the king who act like that's not some sort of illness, right? So let's just all be a responsible adult and start taking upon ourselves to put stimulus and response separate and put our thinking back in the middle, because that's what gives us our choice. It's that choice of thinking or not to think that gives us our freedom, and that's what makes America's opportunity. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. I went through public schooling, and so going through public schooling and not being exposed to the legitimate, real history of how the world works, I found to be disappointing. I found it even more disappointing to find out that I had attended a respectable university for 5 years. They never made me aware that such a book or such a perspective on how the world works exists, let alone the fact that it had serious credibility. So I wandered through corporate world for many years until I bumped up against reality. There's a great George Orwell quote where he says, usually you can maintain your illusion until you bump up against reality, usually on a battlefield. And so, bumping up against reality, then you go and search and say, what's the credible information that's out there that someone else has encountered this before and is left behind so I can learn from it. And luckily, the book that really helped me put things together wasn't so much a book like None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Like I was aware of these type of conspiratorial books, but they always lacked the substantial references and interconnectivity to tell a bigger picture without dumbing it down and making it cartoonish. And so when I found out about the story of Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley and it being published in 1966 by Macmillan, having its plates destroyed so that it could cease circulation, and there must have been an important message in there. They rebranded the book as The World Since 1939, a history, which only gave you the last half of Tragedy and Hope. And so there became bootleg copies out there, but some of the bootleg copies and republished copies didn't even contain the unabridged version of Tragedy and Hope. It claimed to be the whole version, and then we had to do a study, as we mentioned with the Ultimate History Lesson with John Taylor Gatto, where we went and compared the multiple versions of Tragedy and Hope to find out what has been censored or excised out. Those pages happen to be 61 through 63, so it's really pages 62 and 63. And we can talk about what those pages mean and why they would have to be censored, or why they would take away the first half of this book, because the last half of the book didn't really make much sense without the first half. And so it's this treasure trove of legitimate, substantial, verifiable, respectable history that rarely anyone ever brought up. So I thought, this is something that it needs to be on the tip of everyone's tongue, and people need to be talking about the contents of this book, because it really does help you. It helps your mind organize the copious amount of content so that you can get a clear and accurate picture of the artifacts and evidence that have been left behind as our legacy here as humans on this planet. It's not the only book by Quigley that's valuable. He wrote The Evolution of Civilizations and The Anglo-American Establishment. And if you read those three books together, you can get a picture of history over the long term. That's like the macrocosm. But he'll also give you the microcosm of power in the 20th and 21st century, because what's going on today is very much a legacy of Cecil John Rhodes, which is a heavy talking point within Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. We're pointing to a real financial central banking empire called the Rothschild family, who funded Cecil Rhodes. This is page 52 in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. We're talking about this ominous continuity that they have a moral obligation, and this is what Gatto calls justified sinning in the Ultimate History Lesson. So this moral obligation allows them to try to gain world control. It's not about British Empire controlling the world. They're just using the British Empire as a vehicle to get world control, and then they control the world everywhere. They're going to be multinational. They're internationalists. That's why they refer to us as isolationists. So this idea of Anglo-Saxon unity was the seed, and that seed grew up into the Pilgrim Society and the CFR and the American International Corporation, where they funded the Cold War, where they funded communism, where they started China and funded Mao. And David Rockefeller said Mao did a great job. These are all real parts of history that if you understood it, then you'd be like, wow, who are we competing against? Why do we have such a big military and defense budget if we really don't have real enemies? We can get into that later, but continuing on, one of the neglected aspects that I've heard thus far is the British East India Company and its role in the British Empire and opium trading. I did hear Brett mention it in an earlier episode in a series about Skull and Bones. That's really the connection with the Russell and Whitney families, is the opium smuggling in the British East India Company. But moving on, Fabianism and eugenics have a very close tie, especially in people like George Bernard Shaw. So when you get into these ideas, it's not just Cecil Rhodes. He just codifies it and gives these people a purpose and a plan and an agenda. All of these ideas of eugenics, that's back in Plato's Republic. So all these ideas are not new, but they've harnessed technology and they've gotten maybe greedier as they've gone on. So what you have are these ideas that were espoused by Plato, picked up through secret societies, carried through time, and they just happen to be, coincidentally, some of the same goals of worldwide Freemasonry that the British Empire was heavily leveraging. That's how they were integrating themselves into these colonies and getting colonized in the first place, was the organizational structure, global organizational structure provided through Freemasonry. So before we get into the CFR and its predecessor, the Pilgrim Society, or something that came after the CFR, like the Union Now Project, these are all Anglo-American establishment working groups, agendas to bring the United States out of its sovereign state back under the British Empire, and the participation of America in, for instance, the Spanish-American War. That's where you really start to see what they called yellow journalism, the use of propaganda on the public, and no longer America being, like Thomas Jefferson said, never needing to fight a war because we've got these great boundaries of oceans. We got called isolationist. America, who wanted to stay out of these things, was isolationist, and we got talked into participating in World War I. There were a couple lies told. It all ties back into Balfour and Lord Rothschild and what was going on in Britain at the time. But, when you look into how America got involved in these foreign wars, where a large percentage of people in America from that time were German speaking, there was a lot of immigrants in this country. So what you look at as far as history is a book like Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. Now, she's the great-great-granddaughter of Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, from World War II. So she's using the personal letters archives of Balfour and, you know, all these characters that she's painting out. And what she paints out as the official establishment history is far different than what we were taught in American schools. And so it just shows that what we've been taught in American schools has been so far removed from even the history that the British Empire teaches its own people. You know, it's noteworthy. So there's this ominous continuity once again between America's participation in collectivist activities, putting bases all around the world. It's not America's idea to do these bases. That's America under British influence, being the front end, the tip of the spear on their empire building. And that's why they also have such a close relationship, the British Empire, with Israel, because they're part and parcel. America, Israel, and Great Britain, there are no lines between those intelligence agencies. Right? And so when you have Kim Philby or Alger Hiss or any of these people that were called spies, those people were working at a higher level. They were working on both sides. They're connected in at, for instance, the Round Table level, because as Quigley notes, and he was Clinton's teacher at Georgetown, Quigley notes that oftentimes the Round Table group works with the communists and capitalists, that they don't have an aversion to this. And Quigley's only aversion was he thought its role in history was so significant that it should be known. In other words, he thought that they were so far ahead in the race that even if they told the public what was going on, the public really couldn't grasp it, organize themselves, and do something about it. To remember, since 1920 on, this group that we're talking about had created the American Historical Association as a front group to provide this British, you know, Anglified, you know, American history, this British spin on Americans, you know, America's fight for independence. And so when you get into you know, what you're referring to in the beginning of your question, it goes back into your last episodes where you're talking about Woodrow Wilson, Colonel House, how Wilson didn't have any credentials, but because Colonel House is advising him, he gets all this stuff done. And you talked about Paris 1919 and redrawing of the map of all these countries around the world. You did a really great job on that. It was all of these different affiliations that we're talking about. These have meaningful connections. We're not just saying these guys went to school together and they shared some textbook in the library. No, what we're saying is they're going through a highly specifically tuned system that creates compartments where they're all reflecting part of what that bigger plan is. So whether it's Stringfellow Barr in his Citizens of the World book, he's a Rhodes Scholar, or Clarence Street in Union Now, this is bringing America together with Britain, or any number of the other names that we've talked about here. Anthony Sutton, he's not only got the great trilogy that talks about how America and Britain funded the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, and you know, America's side was also funded by these same central bankers. But when I think Brett mentioned international relations, the whole idea of international relations and the CFR is a subset of international business and banking, which was started by the Rothschild family when they took over 5 different countries' central banking system and had an encrypted courier system that they used to communicate so that no one else could, you know, they created some paper currencies. There's a whole fascinating history. That's not conspiracy theory. That's on the Rothschild Enterprises. It's the Rothschild Family Banking Empire website. So when you get into, they own hundreds of different companies, but when you go to their main site, it lists it in the history. It tells about Waterloo and all, you know, the stock market and everything that you might have thought was a conspiracy theory. If you look at the primary sources, these people are ready and proud to admit it. This is the role they occupy in history. So this idea of the Pilgrim Society that Kevin's talking about, it's an Anglo-American, it's a transatlantic union of rich people. That's really what it is. And Andrew Carnegie plays into this. It started by Rhodes' last will and testament when he dies in 1902. And then you have that going forward. So this other character that Kevin mentioned was William T. Stead. He's the if you get the book, The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes, William T. Stead is the publisher of that book. He's the original member of the Rhodes Roundtable. He died on the Titanic, which J.P. Morgan owned. And so now we're getting into the 20th century, around the time of the World War I, and how these groups, you know, kind of drop the deadwood, and they continue on with their own plans of Federal Reserve, Council on Foreign Relations, and that's where really you have magnates like the J.P. Morgan Empire, the Standard Oil Rockefeller Empire, kind of all join forces in the name of transnationalism, collectivism. This is admitted by David Rockefeller on page 405 of his memoirs, where he says people accuse us of doing these things, and he says it's true. So he's, you know, observing that Americans don't read yet, but it's out there. So it's these ideas that we're trying to, you know, communicate. I mean, Brett is just now, you know, kind of wading in through this aspect of history, but it's a single thread that connects through history, that if you learn about the different branches on this tree, then you're going to have a much more contextually full and rich understanding of that's what's going on today. The British are funding Muslim Brotherhood, and that's all done through the Anglo-American establishment all the way back into the 20s and 30s when they set up the Saudi royal family. So today's events, today's news that you're seeing, you can actually understand what's going on, and you can dismiss the arbitrary points being brought out to you by corporate media and start digging into the substantial history that we've laid out, not only in the School Sucks podcast, but in the Peace Revolution podcast and all the other productions that we've made over the years, because that's the focus point. If you can get things in focus to where you can see clearly by using these lenses through communication and critical thinking and history, then you're really working with all the tools that you need to find your way, make a map, and keep on balance. It is out in the open for those of you who care to read about it. The book I would recommend is The History of the Rhodes Trust by Sir Anthony Kenny. He's a knight of the British Empire. And in the back of that book, if you look up through the index, he'll tell you that the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, he left his his amenities and his legacy to the Rothschild family, who had funded him in the first place to go down there. So basically, he's a worker bee that went out and did a bunch of stuff, then left it back. They control it through All Souls College at Oxford. This is described by Carroll Quigley in his book, The Anglo-American Establishment, and it's also in the Brain Model. So when you follow these Rhodes Scholars back, there's the Rhodes Trust at Oxford, but there's also the Rhodes Roundtable Group. And to get into All Souls College, Oxford, you have to be a graduate of Oxford and invited. It's not just like any of the other colleges at Oxford. Something that Griffin describes as the rings within rings theory. He attributes it to the Bavarian Illuminati, and Kevin can comment to that because he's done the most research into their original papers and evidence. But what I would notice is, yes, what they do is you have a small circle of people who know that they're getting one over on everyone else, but then they recruit kind of lackeys. These are the types of people that you would see in the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Group, Bilderberg, these types of working groups, because they're not in the central circle. So when Warren Beatty or Angelina Jolie's in the CFR, or Harrison Ford's advertising and shilling for them, I don't think they've taken the time to read Tragedy and Hope or familiarize themselves with Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament. That stuff's not even really on their radar, because you're talking about people who don't do their own thinking in the first place.
What might not be fully understood is the motives for collusion with what seems to be an ideological group like the Council on Foreign Relations. Like, this is a policy group. This is a think tank, at least as it would be explained to people in the world today. So why are they such great financial allies, Morgan and Rockefeller, of something like the CFR or related groups?
Well, the whole policy of the CFR, I mean, when you get into the history, it's to collectivize America. It's to make America a part of the British Empire. It's to control our domestic and our foreign policy making by having many people in CFR throughout our government and all working off the same script, though compartmentalized. So what you're not picking up through Norman Dodd as he's going through the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation, undermining our country through the education system to control the statecraft machinery of this country, the State Department, and our foreign and domestic executives. So you see there's a comprehensive plan that's being worked into our culture. It's being integrated into our culture while no one's really looking. They see the Council on Foreign Relations magazine and they're like, oh, what a stately looking magazine. It's very respectable, and you've got Philip Zelikow and John Deutsch, and none of these people, Richard Haas is in charge of it. So Hank Greenberg and Henry Kissinger, these are all respectable politicians. But if you read those books, what they're telling each other ahead of time is, hey, here's what we're going to do. Because I've got a 1998 issue here that clearly talks about catastrophic terrorism and Osama bin Laden, two separate articles. But when I reviewed this with Brett the other day, I mean, the term weapons of mass destruction shows up no less than 4 or 5 times in this article. It talks about World Trade Center. It talks about Pearl Harbor. It talks about all the things that the neocons allegedly came up with. Well, they're in this magazine, and you should check it out. It is the November/December 1998 edition of Foreign Affairs. And, oh, look, John Deutsch and Philip Zelikow. Philip Zelikow, he's the guy who takes care of the 9/11 Executive Commission and writes that report where everyone unanimously agrees on what's true. That's interesting.
Collectivism is essentially even progressivism in its modern form, I really see as the greatest evil disguised as the greatest good. Collectivism especially, like, oh, don't be selfish, pitch in, join the team, shoulders to the wheel. But what really is hidden in that is something very, very nefarious. This was a plan that Quigley points out was drawn up in Paris, right after World War I. But how does that start to impact the political, academic, and really foreign policy discussions in the United States over the course of the rest of the century?
Well, the way this affects it is that Lionel Curtis is probably singled out by Quigley as the most important person involved in the Rhodes-Milner Roundtable group. He even tells Rudy Maxa to, I don't even know if you want to talk about this guy, and that's the Washington Post interview that you can hear from 1974 with Carroll Quigley. Lionel Curtis, you have to really look into the founding of All Souls College and how these individuals went on to establish their long tenures versus what was normal at the time. So you had Lionel Curtis as well as Lord Halifax, who would go on to hold ambassadorships and many, many prominent positions. You had groups of individuals who had a small circle, a small ring of people that had access to power and influence who were following in the exact same legacy. So how this continues in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, and before you have the Hotel Majestic meeting with individuals from the United States and from Great Britain who were also members of the Pilgrim Society, who got together and decided that they needed to have these bodies established on both sides of the Atlantic to control foreign policy. So it's really a power and influence clique that has been in control since the early 1900s. Out in the open. They announced that the Council on Foreign Relations had J.P. Morgan money quite some time ago. So you can see these competing interests, but you have to look at the common threads. And something I didn't want to get away from, to make my earlier point, if I may, was that the use of technology as a way to stop them from decline in order to merge a cultural interest is seen in fruition when at the Pilgrim Society's first meetings, they're able to use the Atlantic Wire because a Pilgrim Society member owns the Atlantic Wire. And they're able to talk back and forth from the English Society as well as the Society in New York at the same time. So they're using these technologies as a way to create an interconnectivity that is light years ahead. So it's a planned obsolescence for the populace and a way to profit off of that planned obsolescence by controlling, the meters that regulate energy and things that we need for our survival today. So it in addition to using technology and using educational technology, I think these things, kind of merge together. And the last point on that would be that All Souls College has a sister school in the United States, and that is the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, where many of the advancement. Exactly, Woodrow Wilson. So Abraham Flexner goes over to All Souls College and spends several years there with Lionel Curtis and with Philip Kerr, who would come around, Lord Halifax, and all of these individuals. And he's the head of Rockefeller money. He's the one that's distributing money throughout the United States. So there's a guy named Tom Jones who in 1940 creates the Pilgrim Trust, which is quote unquote not connected to the Pilgrim Society, but it happens to create this same Institute of Advanced Study where now you have the most powerful groups on either side of the Atlantic, the Cliveden set and the Georgetown set, as well as the Wall Street bankers, in control and at the forefront of the greatest technologies that are not available even yet to the public. And this is what continues to this day.
And, in a moment, we can move into Anthony Sutton and Zbigniew Brzezinski and show you how this all ties into the cybernetics, the smart grid, the smart devices, everything you see today. We'll tell you about the history in a second, but I just wanted to concentrate on Flexner. He said this name, Flexner. There's a book out there called Rockefeller Medicine Men. It shows how the Rockefeller Foundation influenced adversely our education system, but also the medical education system, including the pharmaceutical complex that grew out of it. So the Flexners, there's two brothers, they write a report, it's all Rockefeller money, corrupts our entire healthcare system and our education system in this country. Good name to dig into. Also, this idea of them taking technology and hoarding it or keeping it away from the public, using it ahead of other people to have a strategic advantage. J.P. Morgan took over Tesla's work and basically boxed it up and kept it away from the public only after Tesla's main funder, the Astor, I forget which Astor it was, if it was Vincent or his father, but the Waldorf Astoria, is this, hotel in New York. It's a German hotel, German family, the Astor family that had been here for a long time. They died. His financier died on the Titanic with William T. Stead. So when you have J.P. Morgan continuing on, and he dies later that year, but his company moves on, and J.P. Morgan and Co., Standard Oil, all these types of funding come together in the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Lionel Curtis group. So Lionel Curtis is there at Versailles. He's there for the Royal Institute of American or International Affairs. He's there for the Council on Foreign Relations, but he's also there in World War II for Clarence Street and these other Rhodes Scholars who create a plan called Union Now to merge America and Britain to unite against communism and to beat the guys in the Cold War. These ideas were circulating, and very famous people in this country supported that plan, and the Rockefellers' rebranding of eugenics for American society under molecular biology.
And there's another great book I would mention by the name of Appeasement, A Study in Political Decline from 1933 to 1939, and we'd be getting more into World War II. But it's by A.L. Rouse, who was a student at All Souls at the same time as Lionel Curtis and all of the founders of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which was funded by Alfred Beat and Lord Amory and those that were best friends of Cecil John Rhodes. And so, you see these other individuals try to set up their own unity by creating their own trust. Alfred Beat created his own trust. Amory created his own trust, but neither one were able to stray from simply funding Rhodes' original vision.
That's because Rhodes's vision was so comprehensive that when it's introduced to America through the Pilgrim Society and the CFRs getting together and the Rockefellers and Standard Oil's like, we're going to fund this, as well as the United Nations, which comes later. The Rockefellers donated the land that the United Nations sits on. That's in their own official history. So you also have this idea, the rebranding of eugenics as the molecular vision of life. And if you read the book Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay, I think it's published by Oxford, and she was an MIT professor. So this is an example of establishment media that they have put out there that we're just taking the time to read. It clearly goes in through MK Ultra, the Dulleses, and the Dulleses were at Paris 1919, the Versailles Treaty, right? So they're involved for a long time. They're in it for the long haul. They're internationalists. And so whether it's molecular vision of life demonstrating the continuity of eugenics, it started in America and Britain, it was introduced into Nazi Germany, but then it came home to roost, and it's still going on today.
Carroll Quigley was an interesting individual in that he went to both Harvard and Princeton. There was an article written about him in the 1970s by a Washington Post reporter that I've been analyzing called The Professor Who Knew Too Much. And what it sought to do was kind of set forth the right-left dichotomy that kind of accompanied this book throughout history, where you have groups that are so-called ultra-right-wing that are attacking this because it's communistic or because it's socialistic. And he even speaks to some of this in an interview he conducted with Rudy Maxa from the Washington Post. Now, the book's significance escaped me my whole life. I didn't come across this in school, like Rich said. This is not something that they teach everybody on a general level. And in some ways, it's something that I don't think Quigley even realized that he had, because he had become so institutionalized within this environment. I mean, he admits that his tutor was an individual by the name of Crane Brenton, who was an OSS officer and station chief. So he's very much inculcated into this establishment politics from the get-go. So when other people are saying, hey, you're exposing a conspiracy, he's saying, well, this is just how it's the way it works.
It's not so much understanding anything from this episode. It's knowing that these things exist, that there's credibility and substance, and we're giving you the stubs and the keys to do your own research, because really, it wouldn't benefit us if we could just transmit our understanding to you. That's like stimulus response. That's kind of creepy. What we want is to inspire you to do the same things that we had to do to get here, to make this show, to be on air, and to communicate these heavy-duty ideas that you're not going to find given to you at any price in any university or any school on the planet.
The Quigley take on what's going on in the 20th century, it's not like he is some great whistleblower shining light into dark places. He's saying, why aren't we telling people about this? This is great. Look how organized you guys are. Why are you keeping this a secret? That kind of speaks to what you were saying, Kevin, about his insulation, right, in intelligentsia and academia. It's like, yeah, this is what we do, right? What people would have a problem with this out there, and it really tells the story of this plan that went into action late 1800s, last couple decades of the 1800s, and it started with a small group of men, but eventually gained what I would describe as an ideological momentum of its own, with lots of carrots for lots of different interest as it continued and as it grew. And you also mentioned None Dare Call It a Conspiracy, written in 1971 by Gary Allen, which is a useful book to get a basic understanding of what Quigley presents in Tragedy and Hope. Obviously doesn't go into nearly as much detail, doesn't name, well, it names a lot of the same names, but without, the massive detail that Tragedy and Hope offers. And I think that, Rich, you said the word cartoon, kind of does this cartoon presentation that I think it's important to understand in the significance of Tragedy and Hope is that these are not cartoon bad guys. They're not James Bond villains. These are people who, maybe didn't even have any recognition of evil intent. And I think when you tell this story to people too quickly, or you make it sound as if there's a real malevolence, like these people aren't even telling themselves a story about how they're doing the right thing, that's the hardest thing for the average person, the average man on the street out there to believe, who that other people would operate with such evil intentions. And I think that's where you lose a lot of people. So as you learn more about the intentions of Rhodes and Milner and all these people that we're going to get into today, there are people who are shaping this ideology that don't really have evil intentions. There are people who will, attach themselves to it as it goes on. I think Griffin said one time that government is a magnet for the predatory class.